The food is so good, okay, and I don't even want to stand here talking, okay, after that meal. And I especially, they told me the chicken is something we must try because this is what they're famous for. But then I just realized that the rib is much better, right? So I enjoy the rib. But anyway, so now I need to get this going, okay, and then what our lunch is supposed to do. And then, but anyway, so in this subject, I'm going to talk about events, okay? And first, I like to do a survey. How many of you are using events? Do. Mary, you are not using event, huh? Okay, we have to teach you how to use it. Anna, are you using event? You're not? We have to teach you. Okay. And you should YouTube, right? Are you using event? No? Okay. So Mandy, you are not using event. Mandy is not using event. Mandy, you are using event. You use event, you don't use it. You do. Maybe not. Okay. So let's see. Okay. Event is very useful. Okay. And then if you know how to use it, unfortunately, you kind of like the concept is a little bit difficult to understand. Okay. And then but once you get a concept and then know how to use it, it's very useful. Okay. You can use it to do many different things. Okay. Now, so the idea behind event is when there's certain activity happening in Elliott, it's an event. Okay. And the invoice got posted is an event. You got to check, that's an event. And you create an order, that's an event. And that's all sorts of things are event in Elliott. Okay. And then well, event happen in Elliott all the time, right? But it doesn't mean something will happen. So first, we support the event, we create the event, and then but if nobody is interested to know about it, it just basically says, okay, I go to sleep. And but if somebody say, hey, I'm interested, and then what will happen is as that event happens, and either there will be email or there will be a message box, okay, or there will be some kind of a technical notes get created because of the event, okay? The common usage is email. And then for example, I can say when a sales order, or let's say not sales order, when a credit memo is created over $1,000, I want to know about it. Okay. And then I can create such an event. And then well, no, I can subscribe to such an event because the event is really supported by Elliott, but I can subscribe to such an event. And then somebody created a credit memo over $1,000. How come I didn't know about it, right? And then you got an email to tell you about it. And then these are the type of things. There's all sorts of things that you can use, okay, in Elliott, okay. And it can be very useful if you know how to use it. And so here I give you a couple of examples when a customer is added, when an order is deleted, okay, when a shipment is received, okay. And so the first thing is, okay, there is a lot of different events supporting in Elliott, but not everything though, okay, because we usually support an event that we consider that are important, but what we consider important event, maybe you consider something important that we didn't think about, right? And then how do you find out what are all the events supporting in Elliott? So now to locate an event, okay, that you are interested, there's two things you should try to know. First is what is a program ID? The second thing is what is the file name? If you know these two information, then you can narrow down and you can find out whether we have such event to support or not. So this is an example. I just print out the, if you go to the, under the utility setup, and then there's a system file. Under system file, there's something called either report or list, okay? And then there's something called a master event list. You go to the master event list, you can print out a list of events supported by Elliott. And you can narrow this down by either by program or by file. In this case, I narrow it down by file, okay? And the file name in this case, I use ARCUSFIL. Now, you probably can make a guess, what is this file? AR stands for account receivable. CUS stands for customer. FIL stands for file. So this is the AR customer file. Your customer record, when you go to the customer file, you add a customer record. We add it to this database, okay? And so if you said, I am interested to know all the activity that may associate with a customer, right? Then you can try to find this direction, okay? There's another direction, which is we can find from the task ID. So on this screen, to the left, okay, you see there's a two red box, right? One is called ARCSHJNL. The other is called ARCUSMMT. ARCSHJNL stands for Account Receivable Cash Journal. So this is the activity that would take place, okay, when you post the cash, okay? And so the next one, ARCUSMNT, stands for Account Receivable Customer File Maintenance. So if you go to your customer file maintenance main screen, right? You go there and then action, you delete a customer. That's the program we're using, okay? And then so the task ID or the program ID is basically the actual program name we're using to do certain things, customer file maintenance, cash receipt, journal posting, okay? So that's an actual program. The file name is actually the database, okay? With these two information, then you can narrow down what you want. And then in this case, the cash journal, it has an event. The event called cash receipt posting. And then in there, okay, we support multiple variable, and the variable support in this case is who's the customer, what is the name, what is the check amount, what is the check number, what is the check date, what is the salesman, and what is the batch, and then what is the payment type, and then what's the, and then there's another one called ACH reference. And then so payment type can be something like, is it a cash receipt, check, is this a credit card, is this ACH, is this etc. Right? So there's a different type of payment type. And then if you say, I am interested to know whenever I have an ACH cash receipt, then you can say, I like to be notified when the payment type is equal ACH. And then when there's an ACH receipt, cash receipt is being posted, you'll be notified, okay? And so that's the idea. And then the next one is adding a customer. So when a customer is added, you can be notified too. So that's the idea behind this, okay? So program ID and file name. And so program ID is important when you're trying to finding out if the event is supported by a certain task like the cash receipt. And the file name is important when you're trying to find out all areas that can affect certain table, like a customer file table, and okay. So how do you find the program ID? You find the program ID by one of the easy way. If it's you go to the Elliott control center. And then inside the Elliott Control Center, there's a column called program. And then, for example, like a customer file, right? You go to customer file maintenance. the program we call is called ARCUSMNT. That's one way you can find out. The other way is when you go to customer file maintenance, notice on the bottom right, okay, there's ARCUSMNT as well. That also indicate this is a program that we are running. Okay, so this is two ways you can run, you can find out. But this will work, in general speaking, for the data entry screen. But for a posting program, that doesn't work. Okay, for example, that in this case, if you look at cash receipt posting, the cash receipt posting, if you look at on the test manager, I'm sorry, on the Elliott Control Center, the program name is ARCSHENT. That is not the actual program do the posting. So to find out the actual program do the posting, you have to go run it. And then in the print option window, notice at the bottom, okay, of the print option window, right beside the cancel button, there's an ARCSHJNL, okay? That's actually the posting program, okay? So I outlined two ways to find out the program ID. One is using the what's on the control center, what is telling you, or the bottom right, or the other one is related to the printing program. You want to know if there's a certain printing program, does it support certain activity, then you just go to the print option window. In the print option window, before you do the printing, at the bottom, you can find that test ID. So this is how you can find out the test or program ID, okay? So now you said, okay, how do I find out the file name, right? That, generally speaking, is more challenge, okay? Because you kind of like need to have the understanding of the database, okay? And now but there's a way to do it, okay? And then you may or may not have the access depending on the admin user let you do it or not. In the Elliott, you go to the file utility, and then you can go initialize file. And then when you go to the initialize file, and then in the drop down, and then it will tell you the 8-digit file name associated with the file. So in this case, you see my highlight, right? The ARCUSFIL is corresponding to customer file, okay? But maybe your supervisor won't let you access this function because this is the initialized file. But if you're the supervisor yourself, then chances are you have the access. Okay. So now, so if we want to manage your event associated with customer, okay, and then what do? Is you go to the customer file maintenance, right? And then in the customer file maintenance, we click on this, the Thunderbolt, okay? And then that is the event button, okay? You click on that Thunderbolt, and it will show you all the event that has been added right now for this particular customer. And then so in this case, you can see there is a cash journal posting event, okay? And then added for this customer. Actually, it's added for all customers, but I will go to the next, okay? So this is actually an event. I created this event myself, okay? And then so in my own company, okay? And then because you gotta remember, you guys know that we have a payment portal, right? So the payment portal is such that, when we send you an invoice, either you can send me the check or you can do the ACH payment, okay? Many of our customers actually is doing the ACH payment, which is great, okay? We would rather get an ACH payment than check, okay? And so when we receive the ACH payment from our payment portal, what happened is it added as a cash transaction. And that cash transaction still need to be posted. And then we schedule a deferred processing at nighttime. And every night it will just go ahead, post the cash receipt, right? So as the cash receipt gets posted, and then if there is a ACH transaction, I like to know. Okay, and then so that's basically what this one for. And you can see on the left side window, right? It said this is related to the AR custom file, right? And the follow you see there's a or, right? The or basically meaning this particular event is associated with all customers. You can either make this cash receive event apply to only one customer, or you can apply to all customers. So in this case, I said, it doesn't matter who is paying the payment. And then I'm interested for everything. And then in the action type, I said, send me the email. And then in the disposition, I say it's a recurring request, meaning that once this event is a trigger, right? And it will trigger again and again, and is recurring. Or maybe you can make it as a one-time event. So meaning that you trigger one time, then it's go to history. It never trigger again. So I need to make it recurring. And then what happened is in the filter tab, and I said, if the payment type is equal to AC represent ACH, okay? So if I receive an ACH payment, I like to get an email. So then in the email tab, you specify how you look like. And so the email tab, first it will send to our accounting manager, and then it will send an email CC to Roger and me. And then the subject is the ACH payment, from is posted. So you see that the ampersand reference dash ID 03 ampersand, right? These are variable. So then what is that variable? And then, well, you can right click and then to insert a variable, and it will tell you these are the variable it will support, and then you can basically insert the variable in there. And then so then when it comes to the time of the actual sending the email, so when it comes to the time of sending the actual email, so this is how the email tab look like, right? Now this is the actual email I get. Okay, because it will resolve those variables into the actual value, and then I receive this email. So that's kind of the idea about an event, how it works, okay? And well, this is actually not an event, but I just want to mention to you, okay, that when you do deferred processing, you could also request when this deferred processing is done, you get a copy of the content of the printing. So this is a example that when the cash receipt is posted, I said, please also email me a copy of the report. And so there you go. I get an email, and then this is the content of the email indicate that, oh, we just received to check. Well, this is not ACH payment, but anyway, it's interesting. I get this email because usually this will be posted during the daytime by our accounting department. So, but I get to receive it through the deferred, meaning maybe they forgot to post the cash. So this is the example of our payment portal. And then so you go to our payment portal, sign in, and then then you can pay us online this way, okay? Just so you know that this is an option available to any one of you. It's not just for Nestlé, because this is a solution implemented by Nestlé, right? So if you guys are interested in implement a payment portal for yourself, okay, you have an option to do it, okay? Because we are basically just use the same system. All right, so this is an interesting event. I don't really recall who created this receive item attribute will not exist. Now, is actually you, Cheryl? Okay. Now, what was the reason that you created this event? Doesn't work. What? Yeah. Certain information. So then basically is so when you receive it, and then if the attribute does not exist, you need to enter this event. Otherwise, we have problem. And then in the meantime, you trigger a event email so you get knows about it. You just pop it up. Yeah. Okay, so I see. Okay, so the event portion is not as critical to you, but it's just kind of like a reminder. Okay, but the most important is it will pop up and ask them to enter those attributes. Okay, so this is basically a event that can be subscribed, and then of course, if you want to trigger this event, actually you have to turn it on. So by default, this is not turned on. And then if you answer the question, say you do want to turn on this event, and then it will ask you, oh, okay, what attribute are required for the item? And then so you can enter, those attributes that you will expect that the warehouse to have on the item. Okay, and then when they do the receiving. This is, I think, similar to one of the things that I think, Aaron, you asked me a long time ago that you stop the user from or you prompt for the weight because you don't really know the weight of the item until you receive it for the first time, right? So you set up the item initially, you set it up as a 0 weight, and then what happens is in the warehouse when they receive it, and then the system said, hey, okay, well, the weight is 0. And then so now enter your weight now. Okay, so that was a similar to that idea. So in Cheryl example is we need certain attribute information for the item. And then so when we're receiving it, please, okay, put those attribute in there. And then if they don't do it, it's gonna keep on nagging and then until they do it. Okay. And we also provide the attribute associated with it. Okay, so this is one of the events. Some of you probably already subscribed to this event, and I know Lipsy subscribed to this event, Davidson subscribed to this event. I'm not sure about Zender, okay, but I know Kingston Press also subscribed to this event, okay. So what happened is when something happens, let's say suppose there's a locking, because in our system we need to do certain update, but somebody keep the record lock, etc. So then, well, you just have to wait for the person to finish the lock, and then in order for it to go, right? But unfortunately, sometimes certain type of locking is a transient, meaning that they go in there, split of a second, they release the lock. So usually those are not issue. But sometimes there's certain lock, okay, that still can happen, is it can stay locked for a long time, okay? And then when those locks take place, and what is happening is to other area user trying to access the record, update the record, they will just need to wait, okay? And then you will see the message on the bottom left corner, and it will say so-and-so log table, and then the record. So in this case, is Jim. Jim is a user, okay? That's a window user, by the way, okay? And log, CPORD HDR, that stands for order header. So Jim logged the order header. And which order header? 201971. So Jim logged the order number 201971. That's basically what it's saying. And then so he logged it when somebody need to do something to that order, happen need to also get a hold of that log. And then his logging is preventing other people to do their job, and then they just being there and then sitting there waiting, right? So now, what is the right thing to do? The person get this message and then go walk to Jim's desk and then say, hey, Jim, you locked the record. Okay, and then can you get out? Okay, and then so that's one way, right? But what if Jim is in the restroom? and his screen is right. But anyway, but we talk about this, okay, and then in uh, in the past we always talk, say, uh, how to be a good citizen of Elliott, okay. So to be a good citizen of Elliott is you should avoid locking record, okay. So let's say, for example, in the order header, you lock the order header record, right? So now that's normal because you bring up an order and then you don't expect another person also bring up the order and then competing with you updating that order, right? So we have to lock the order header. Now, if you bring up an order header, now do your job quickly, okay? And then don't stay there, hogging the record for long. But if you just stay there for long, and then other people can end up hitting you, okay? And then you are not a good Elliott citizen. And so how to be a good Elliott citizen is basically you do your work and you do it quickly and you finish it, get out. Don't put yourself in a state that you are preventing other people doing your updating. That's how to be a good citizen. So if you are in the order header, you have to be conscious, say, hey, I'm locking a record now. And then if I have no business there, if I want to go to the restroom, I want to take a lunch break, hey, get out that order header screen, okay? Don't stay there, okay? And then so that's how to be a good Elliott citizen. And then so that's usually that's the one thing I was preaching people how we can basically, prevent we lock each other up. Now, the record locking also have an event, okay? And so if somebody is locking the record for say over 1 minute and they haven't released yet, and guess what? Okay, the admin people can receive the email, or whoever can subscribe to the event and then can receive the email and indicating that so and so is locking this record and then for how long, etc. And I have seen situations like because I also subscribe to some of your locking event, right? I'm part of the list, and I was just watching how bad it can go, and then in some situations it can go 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and it's still locking. All right, so in the past, in the early day, right? I was just trying to call you and say, hey, are you aware that there's a locking event going on? And after so long, I just say, okay, I get tired, I don't worry about it. Yeah, that's good. That's, we also did something called the phantom locking, okay, and then that also helped, okay, and so anyway, so now this is another thing that's interesting, okay, because in many situations, right, when the user is causing the locking and he or she doesn't even know, okay, and then so then so then there's a new way. It's not just you can email to the admin, you can email to that user, say, hey, your locking record, did you know that? So this is the example. So when you're trying to create an event, okay, and in the two email address, right? Typically, you would just type in the email address, maybe the admin, right? But you cannot really type the offending user email because you don't know who, right? I mean, anybody can cause in this blocking. And then so right now we support a system variable in that two field. And if you right click and system variable, there is something called the email by window user ID. Okay, you choose that email by window user ID. It will then ask you, say, oh, cool. Okay, so which variable is that? Now we trigger that event, right? We know the in the locking event, okay, the variable number one is a record number, okay, which you don't care, okay, and the record number two is the window user ID. In this case, is Jim, okay, and then okay, Jim, okay? So Jim is at the reference ID number 2. Okay, so I know that. So I can get Jim. And then so then what happened is when there's a logging going on, so we trigger the event. We said, oh, well, who do we need to send to? We need to send to the window user's email address. So we look up the window user is Jim, right? So from Jim, I can actually find out what his earlier user ID. Jim is not an earlier user ID. Remember that? Jim is not an earlier user ID. Jim is the window user ID. His earlier user ID can be something else. So I guess I want to ask a challenging question, okay? How do we figure out a window user ID email address? Anybody want to try? Yes. Yeah, the bottom corner show the window user ID. So we know the user ID is Jim, but that's the window login. We need to figure out what is the email address for the, yes. Right, that's basically pretty much it, okay? And then you, uh, yeah, current user list. Now, okay, so do you guys remember that if you go to earlier and then you said user list, right? In a user list, it gives you a big table of all the user in there, right? In that user list, we have a window user ID, we have an earlier user ID, and we have an email address right in there. The email address in that table came from the earlier user setup. Okay, but the cross-reference of the window user ID to the earlier user ID is in that user list. Not too bad, then he doesn't get an email. So this is basically the value. Okay, so people ask me, say, is there values to set up that email address in the user password setup? I said, yeah, there is. Okay, there's different places we use it. Okay, and then so there's a value for you to set it up. Okay, so now, so this is so using this way, we figure out the email address and then we send to that user, say, hey, you are locking us up, okay, etc. Please get out. So this is something new. We just got this supported maybe within the last 6 months, something like that. Okay, just so you know. Okay, so this is an example. Okay, and oh, well, this one. Okay, this one is interesting. Okay. Now, sometimes user, for whatever reason, right? They get a fire IO error and it display, and then but they just click OK, and then they go on their life, and then they probably doesn't bother to talk to you, and then they just try again, maybe it works or etc. But if everything works, they don't report to the manager or supervisor, right? So what is happening, this is also something new, okay, that we now have the ability so that when there's a fire access IO error taking place, we trigger an event. And then if you subscribe to that event, you can get an email to know who, okay, is the one that got the error, from what workstation, and when the user was doing what, and what is the data file, that causing this error, all this thing, okay, can be emailed to admin user. Okay, so this is new, okay? I think this is good information. And I think this is especially going to be helpful if you subscribe to the for deferred processing. Okay, and now during the day, okay, user process, you get an error. Okay, so they continue, get out, and then do what they need to do, right? But what if in the middle of a deferred processing, you get a file IO error? Your deferred processing stop. Okay, don't you want to know about it? Okay, and then so you do. Okay, so you can subscribe to this event, and you see in this EXE process, okay, it's called ELA60P. So you want to, well, actually, that's not, I guess that's not a, that's just generic, I guess. Okay, so maybe not a good way to do it. But the idea is, so say you can subscribe to this event, so then this IO error happen, you knows about it. Okay. Now, the other one is some of you using this serial number correction utility, I'm pretty sure. Okay, and then so Cheryl, you use it, right? Lipsy, do you guys use it, right? And then so the when you are using this correction tool, we now also support an event, okay, that you can trigger and then you can subscribe who correct the serial number. Import price mismatch event. This one is sponsored by Aaron. Okay. Now the driving reason for this is because Lipsy right now do certain sales order import automatically. So meaning they just use the deferred processing to schedule it and then automatically import. And now, of course, when you import, sometimes the price by the trading partner is different than your price you expected, right? Now, so then we said, okay, so what do you do? Do you want to stop the import or do you want to import it and not knowing about it? No, that doesn't sound right. So you want to let it import, but you want to have an event to tell you that we have import sales order and the price mismatch. Go look into it. That's the idea behind this event. Okay. PO export by vendor event. Oh my God, I'm really late. Okay. And so this is basically because, well, let's say suppose you do the vendor VDI integration. And then when you do that, and then the when the vendor, when you trying to, because not everybody need to send the EDI PO, okay, for the vendor. And then so, but maybe in the setup processing, maybe something set up right, maybe wrong, etc. So how do you know that when you create a PO, the EDI is being sent, okay? So one way to confirm is if the file is exported, then you know there's a EDI is going to go to that vendor. If the file is not exported, then it's not sent, right? So then what you can do is you can say, okay, I know, say John, he handle purchasing with Ruger. So then you go to Ruger, you subscribe this event for John. And then so when John plays PO with Ruger, he's supposed to receive email. If he doesn't get an email, something wrong, okay? And then so this is the type of the scenario that you can use it for. And this one requires UPC for PO line item. And this is basically saying that because maybe, you need a UPC code in order to send the PO to the vendor, but maybe the UPC code hasn't been set up for the item yet. But that doesn't stop the buyer from adding the PO, right? But you want to know that when the buyer placing order with this PO and a line item that doesn't have UPC code, you want to know about it, okay? And then so then they can take action to correct it. And sales order import error event, and this is basically, again, I mentioned that Xender is, I'm sorry, not Xender, Lipsy is automated the sales order import. And so when the sales order doing the import, maybe sometimes there's a serious problem, okay, with the order. Maybe they are ordering an item that we don't even have. The UPC code doesn't exist, etc. Right? So obviously we cannot import that order. So when the order doesn't get import, we put that order into import error folder. So then it doesn't come back and then try to import the error order again. So, but we don't want to say out of sight, out of mind, right? So as we move that file to an error folder, we need to trigger email to tell the admin people, hey, there was an order we tried to import. There's a problem. We didn't import it. And now go look at it. So that's the purpose of this event. Okay. So I'm going to stop here. And then is there any question for this? Yes, Anna? Has enter order item does not have a bill of material set up. I think that would be a good event to add. Okay. But uh, okay, so you vote for that. Okay, so the all right. Okay, so you know you guys what you guys should do. You go to the support.elliot.com and then put in your idea and then document it clearly. And then what happened is you want to get an email of other gentlemen and then say, hey, Eric, go vote for it, okay? And, and Don, go vote for it, okay? And then we'll see, oh, okay, we have many people support this, okay? And that's basically how you do it. But I'm gonna say do this, okay? And I'm going to try my luck, okay, with this. Email Edward Kwong.
Which one? What's the subject of your email?
And trigger event when adding an order without bill material setup.
Okay. What would you like the email to say?
The same thing.
Here's your message to Edward Kwong. Okay, I'll send it.
Look at that. Technology. All right, so that's it. Let's take a break for, let's try to be short. Take a break for 5 minutes. Okay, thank you.
Or if you're a bit in the middle of a presentation, I'll just answer them. Oh, actually, yes, one. I'll take it with you. You tell me? No, 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 no. Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
But we have, yeah, that's right. No. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Right, right. Oh, yeah. Because, you know, game on Sunday, you know,
No, I mean, they're part.
I think she doesn't do it, yeah.
It's pretty much.
Yeah. It's very big. Yeah. But yeah, early on, that is one of your. Yeah, I would say not. Yeah. In that I'm pretty sure you're right.
One 45 to 2:30. Oh, okay. I need to get going with it. Right. Okay. So any one of you have the coin, this is the time you need to go claim your shirt. Okay, anybody? Now is the time to claim your shirt. Say that again? No, I'm not out of coin, okay, but it's just, they have a logistic problem because they need to clean it up. You know, they ask us to get out of here at 4 o'clock, right? And then so they are really putting us under pressure. And then so, but you know, it's because originally we're supposed to at the ballroom, and then we don't have this problem. But because the ballroom is under construction, so they ask us to move to here. and except they have a wedding tonight, and then they cannot let us to stay too long, and then they want me to out at 4 o'clock. And then I said, oh yeah, okay, you should give me a discount for this. But they did give me a concession, okay, and then they, you know, originally they were going to charge you overnight for parking, but they waived it. So that's a concession, and then, but anyway, okay, so we need to get started, okay, and then we are behind, and then I don't want to, you know, take all the time from Roger. Okay, now the this is not a right slide. I need to go to what's new in Elio.